Oh, does that WeWork have different mugs?
No, I had to buy one, man. This is a Starbucks mug.
Why did you have to buy a mug? Does that WeWork not have mugs?
They only have the small ones. See? Starbucks. So I got so upset by the small ones. Isn't that ridiculous?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's like, I don't know if it's the whole, like, you're in California and you have to save everything.
I was going to make a joke, like they only have like paper mugs that sing right after 30 seconds.
Yeah. It's pretty bad. People here are very conscientious about things like that. But I got so frustrated because it's like not satisfying to have one of those half cups. So this morning after my CrossFit workout, I went to Starbucks and got one of these, and I filled this sucker up 3 times today and poured out half of it each time it got cold. And I just look at people right in the face, right eye to eye, as soon as I pour it out in the sink. And
they're like, hey, asshole, that's why we have the small mugs.
And I just have my Brooklyn shirt on and my backwards hat, and, it's no problem for me. So, oh, man. No, it's pretty cool here, though. It's pretty nice. I'm nomading it. So I just come in every day after my workout, and I have my gym bag, and I just sit at a table, and my butt's there for like 8 hours. And it's pretty cool, though. It's smaller than ours.
The conference rooms are good, though?
Yeah, this is the first day I used it. I just recorded a Tailwind video in here, and now I'm here talking to you. So This is pretty cool. There's like a little balcony right outside, because it's on the second floor, so you can just pop out there, sit in a chair. I was eating lunch out there, reading out there, and it's I just spilled some coffee.
Looks like it's right on your computer.
Almost. It's 70 degrees right now. It's been 70 degrees every day, so pretty sweet. Cool. Yeah, man. Between WeWork and CrossFit, you can really live anywhere. I feel like I'm just doing my normal routine. It's pretty cool. Because normally when you travel, it's like you just can't get anything done and you're off your at least that is for me anyways, Yeah. There's something really nice about knowing what you're going to get, from something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, travel sucks.
Right, but this time I feel like I was able to get right into it pretty quick, so it's kind of cool.
Very nice.
So, man, we've been doing some Ember stuff. So I just was doing Tailwind. We deprecated our Ember CLI Tailwind add-on, and can kind of pour one out for that guy. That was a good one. But I spent a long time yesterday actually prepping. I just shot this little 30-minute video removing Ember CLI Tailwind from EmberMap's front-end code base. And it took me a while to prep yesterday because, man, like the PostCSS stuff, how it interacts with Sass. It's really funny, like, it's just another example of like unknown unknowns. Mm-hmm. I've been talking a lot with like Ed and some other folks just about understanding how Embroider changes Ember development, getting a better grip on dependency stuff as we've been working on Mirage and, all this build tooling stuff, roll up, ES6 module, all this stuff, how it relates. And it's just like, I think this is one of those areas where, what was that quadrant? Remember the quadrant, like software you write for yourself, software you write for someone else, software that other software needs to use. What was that from?
Yeah. I don't remember. We talked about that on an episode, though.
Yeah, it's really true. And like I feel like the build tooling stuff really hits all those points because it's just so much unknown complexity there. When I first made Ember CLI Tailwind, I was like, the Ember community uses Sass a lot. So, it's just kind of like, okay, you have a Sass pipeline, like you have a main CSS file, you can import things. And like if you want to import some styles from like Ember Modal Dialog or Liquid Fire, you just put them at the top of your thing and you import them. Kind of the way you would, back in the day, you import jQuery and you import other Google Maps and then you start writing your code. That's kind of our mental model for it. And so when we first got into Tailwind and wrote Ember CLI Tailwind, the add-on, it's the same thing. It's like, all right, mentally what I want to happen here is like the add-on's going to like build Tailwind and then make it available as an importable file for the host app. And the host app's going to like import it at the top alongside its other stuff. And then, you just go to town on your Sass things. And like, it's really the opposite of how it should be thought about because of how PostCSS works. So I was talking to Adam yesterday and trying to kind of figure out what's the best way to get off of this and to like teach people how to think about this. And
wait, could you explain that opposite comment? Because that doesn't feel intuitive.
I know. So you look at the Tailwind docs, it explains how basically it's funny because it's like a SAS is a preprocessor, right? Mm-hmm. And then Tailwind is a PostCSS plugin. So the preprocessor should come first. The idea is that PostCSS is like Babel for your CSS files, but like PostCSS works on CSS files. So instead of like building Tailwind and making it available as an import, what you want to do is like run your SAS through your preprocessor and get rid of all the SASisms, and then you're left with like just CSS files that you then run through your PostCSS pipeline.
Okay.
And then there's like the 3 Tailwind directives, which the Tailwind PostCSS plugin will replace with all the utilities based on your config values. So it's like, it's really confusing though, like, and it gets really tricky when you have kind of one thing that needs to run and then hand something off to the next. And I don't want to get too much into the details. I mean, there's some interesting things there because it's like, how does this work if you were just using a Webpack app or a Gulp app? Like, if you had a Gulp pipeline set up, you could just go in from one thing and out to the next. So you could just go from SAS to CSS and then to PostCSS, and it would just be a continuous thing. But like with Ember and Broccoli, it's more complicated. Like, how do you get the input of one thing into the output of the next? So it took me a while to figure out the best way to set it up based on the fact that our source code had .scss files in the actual disk. And so you can't point PostCSS to those things, unless you do some extra work.
So how do you, is it the video you made, do you like show controlling the run order to make sure that SAS runs first and then PostCSS?
Fortunately, Ember CLI PostCSS, the add-on, has a mode. It's kind of confusing what it's called. It's called compile versus filter, but the idea is filter was added afterwards to say, oh, if you already have like a preprocessor step, we'll just wait for you to do all that stuff and then filter what ends up in your app, like your CSS tree after all that stuff is run. And that's how it can kind of play nice with like Ember CLI SAS that's already running on your CSS files, SCSS files. So that just kind of happens to work and it's nice. And so that's what I showed in the video, and that's the best way to get off of it. But like the next step will be to get off of SAS and to only use PostCSS. And, I went down this whole rabbit hole, man, where like I had PostCSS using a SAS plugin. So you can...
So you delegate the whole thing to PostCSS.
Exactly. And that felt right, but then I ran into some stuff and it was like not really worth it. So, yeah, it's just really confusing.
I was going to make a comment. Like, I don't, EmberMap's code base, I don't think there's a lot of SAS stuff. Or if there is, it's like legacy code we could just probably pretty quickly refactor out. But I do think it's really good that you showed this in the video, because I know that when we first started adopting functional CSS, we had a ton of existing SAS. So I think it's really important that these two things work together.
Exactly.
So
and like, what's the incremental step? Because I had already went through this with someone else on an existing app. They're like basically just tearing it all out and like trying to modernize it. And I think there's a lot of people in this situation. So, I think there's some people who maybe aren't in the Ember community or who aren't writing apps the way we have. SAS just took root in the Ember community. And so basically every app is like, oh yeah, install Ember CLI SAS, right? But like these days, you might not do that if you were starting a new React app or a Vue app. And so
also too, a lot of the Ember apps that I work on are years old. So like it makes sense that they're using SAS because they were started when, they were started before the Tailwind existed.
Right, exactly. So this is really nice because it lets you keep your SAS in. You get out Ember CLI Tailwind, which lets you have Tailwind CSS as like an actual dependency of your project, which is great because, as I explained at the end of the video, it's like, and this will be a free video too. You have Tailwind CSS 0.7.4, and now you want to upgrade to 1.0, and you can just read the 1.0 upgrade guides from the website, which is like phenomenal.
Yeah.
And we're moving that way as a community for everything. And so it's going to be like that with Mirage. You're going to have Mirage JS as opposed to Ember CLI Mirage where, just over the weekend I fixed a bug and Tobias was asking, okay, when can we have this release in Ember CLI Mirage? Like, how can we get away from that? But like, it's hard. It's not always as simple as you think. Like, we kind of are moving back and saying like, oh yeah, it's good to just read the docs for all this. But then like, I don't know, like the Vue CLI lets you have PostCSS and it does some of the wiring for you, but it also exposes it somehow. So I think there's a way to strike that balance,
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a trade-off here of it's awesome when I can install Ember CLI Tailwind, and that's it. And I get everything. And I get builds. I don't even have to know about any of that. I don't even know how Tailwind and PostCSS work together because I've been so fortunate that I can just use Ember CLI Tailwind.
Right.
The other end of this trade-off is, now you're tied to whatever version of Tailwind that Ember CLI Tailwind uses.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yep. I know it is interesting, and I think, yeah. I don't know what the answer is. I guess as things get more standardized, these days with auto import, you can just import directly from NPM, and so that experience is basically the same here as it is for people using Create React App or Vue CLI. But then there's other issues where, there's issues like if you have a new Create React app, you can't add PostCSS to it without ejecting. You can't. So they just said nope. And there's another package. This is the thing. React is so popular. There's another package called like Create React App Customize something. So it like lets you add things without having to eject. And there's like an escape hatch there for doing that. But it's not just an Ember thing, right? It's a real thing.
Also, too, I saw a guide that you basically set up when you run Create React App. You do like yarn Tailwind and yarn start, and you basically have two processes running. One that's rebuilding your Tailwind, and the other that's rebuilding your React app.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot that is good about Ember add-ons and how they orchestrate with each other, and one plugin can hand things off to a next. I think the biggest problem with the Ember add-on ecosystem is just the size, and the documentation means that a lot of this stuff is not really super well understood. But if, again, talking to Adam, he's like, oh, well, if this was like a Webpack project, you would add like one loader dot another loader, and you would be able to just do like Sass and then Tailwind. But it's like there's no real easy way to do that without having a really deeper understanding of Broccoli and the Ember CLI PostCSS add-on. Like if that add-on didn't exist, getting PostCSS to build files from your source and rebuild things that it's watching an app, there's just a lot there. So, it's tough. There's a lot there, and it's good to think about too, because like I've been helping someone get Mirage JS set up with a Vue Cypress app, and it's a similar kind of thing where you can, on the one hand, try to expose the lowest level things that they can use to wire it up themselves. Or you could imagine like, oh, they just import Cypress Mirage from Mirage JS and just like run it before each, almost like a setup Mirage hooks for QUnit. And I think we've learned our lesson that like the first step is going to be some of the lower level stuff that we want to work on so that we don't fall behind maintaining that stuff,
Yeah, or we don't, yeah. Or us getting the abstraction wrong is just as brutal.
Right.
It's a very easy mistake to make too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, and then I've also been looking at Octane stuff because, we don't have a lot of patience and we're kind of conservative. So we've just been waiting and waiting. Well, I guess we have patience, but we don't have patience for paper cuts. So we've been waiting until Octane's been more stable. And I think 3.14 is coming out really soon. And 3.13 has already landed, which means all of the Octane features are there, but they're still working on the guides and the generators and some stuff like that. But 3.13 is out for sure. 3.14 looks like it's coming the week of October 27th, it says. So
awesome.
But yeah, I've been reading some of the stuff there, and we're going to do a lot of new material there. We're going to make, we have an admin app that we use to run EmberMap. Basically, it's like our CMS for EmberMap that hosts all of our videos and lets us upload podcasts and all that stuff. And we're going to be rebuilding that as an Octane app. And that's going to be a video series showing us do that. that's going to be like longer videos, like us getting into the nitty gritty and like how we would code buttons and links and UI components and do data fetching and all that kind of stuff with Octane. And I think we're also going to do some like real basic up and running with Octane. You know, I'm thinking like 6 to 8 videos, like keeping them short. What's the new stuff? Like for someone who maybe already knows Ember, what's really the key points that are new. So I'm excited about all that stuff.
You know, along those lines, one thing I've been doing is upgrading EmberMap's code base. So we were on 3.4 and I brought us up to 3.12 to get ready for this. By the way, from 3.4 to 3.12, I went 3.4 to 3.8, you know, cleaned up all the warnings and then went to 3.12. And each of those steps took me like an hour and a half, 2 hours.
That's ridiculous, man. And we've been using Dependabot, right?
Yeah. Yes. So we've been using Dependabot.
And that's a huge part of it. I mean, if you're listening and you don't do that, that's just such a game changer.
It was unbelievable. Like just when I started this and just doing yarn upgrade interactive -- latest and basically seeing that everything was pretty much the latest. And just got to dive right into Ember CLI update. You know, there were some things like with Fastboot. A lot of the Fastboot projects had moved from like Fastboot 1.2 to 2.0 within like the last month or two, and so those I just did all at once. But that it was also painless. I mean, there were some weird errors, but they were just because of other add-ons we were using, and you know, painless. But yeah, I was really impressed.
That is awesome. The update. Yeah, that's really, really cool. It feels good. I mean, that's the kind of, I also think it's like, sometimes we've wanted to do like little series or videos or work on little pieces of EmberMap, and it's when it's fallen behind and it's old stuff and it has Tachyon CSS and old Tailwind and the Ember CLI Tailwind that's outdated. But now it's like you do this incremental style where you amortize the cost of all this stuff and you get rid of all the isms and you just keep it low level. But it's like, it really changes the calculus. Like on the one hand, the Ember CLI Tailwind with the no wiring and no time wasted is amazing. And having the low level stuff can really suck. But on the other hand, if you pair the low level stuff with something like Dependabot, maybe it changes the balance, the equation. Because yeah, I have to understand how to get PostCSS and Tailwind wired up. But with Dependabot there, now I'm just going to know, like when I want to actually do something, you know, it's going to be up to date, and it's going to be up to date with the actual source project. And it matters less, right? Like having things abstracted matter less when you have that. Like having all those dependencies, you know, the way Create React does it with React scripts. You just have one dependency to update. I actually don't care about that if Dependabot is literally automatically updating all my dependencies for me, like in the extreme case, right? And actually in the extreme case where you have Dependabot upgrading all your dependencies, I'd rather have the exposed one so I could add PostCSS and not be locked out of it based on a Create React abstraction or the equivalent in Ember, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. That is an excellent point.
So that's kind of interesting.
I think one, you know, just going back a little, one thing you said about amortizing the cost of the upgrade with, you know, just merging 1 or 2 Dependabot PRs every night or every day. I think that makes like a really big difference. And it's not just about merging those packages, but then it's also like, you know, that afternoon you're going to start doing feature development. And you're going to run Ember test server, and you're going to get maybe some deprecations from those new packages. And it's very easy to go ahead and fix those
while you're there.
While you're there, and it's only 2 packages, or one, you know, it's really only 1 package, and it's only like once a week. The deprecation guides for the whole 3x series in Ember have been fantastic. They give you a link. You just go there, you kind of read the reasoning behind it, and they have before and after examples. It's, you know, it was seriously like the smoothest upgrade that I've ever done across any framework or app. So felt very, very good. Yeah.
That's really cool. And it's just fun to be, I mean, EmberMap is an old app. It's like 3 years old.
Yep.
And there's like a lot of old idioms in there, and there's like weird stuff in there. And the fact that it's just basically upgraded and we really haven't been working on it that much is amazing. Like once we start working on it for this new series, like we're going to be in a fresh environment and it's going to feel really good, you know?
Yep.
So were you going to talk about some Ember stuff, or is it mostly the upgrades?
I don't think I have any Ember stuff to talk about this week. I've just sort of been chugging along at Ember.
Yeah. Let's talk about ES modules.
Yes.
So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and it was prompted by, I'm just keeping my eye on the clock because I think I have this room for another half hour, but earlier it didn't matter. So I'll just give them a New York finger if someone comes and knocks on the door. Like, your account is no longer allowed at this WeWork location. So we were talking about ES modules. So originally, how did this come about? It came about because we were working on Mirage JS, and we wanted Mirage to be able to be imported in a Node environment. And not because it works yet, but because as you start using JavaScript app code, like a React app or a Vue app or even an Ember app, and fast boot in different environments, in our case it was Gatsby pre-rendering an app, and the import broke because Mirage depends on Pretender, and Pretender is made to run in a browser environment.
I think specifically Pretender depends on like what wig fetch to polyfill XHR, and then Mirage like digs its claw, or not Mirage, Pretender digs into XHR to monkey patch it to like intercept requests.
That's right. So that just that variable wasn't defined on the global like process when that code ran in Node.
You're correct. Yep.
And it did work in Node if you happen to be running in the JS DOM environment, because that code polyfills that beforehand.
Yep.
So kind of where we ended up, we did a bunch of things with the build and trying to like, come up with different ways and shimming Pretender and what wig fetch and adding an if window before it and all this stuff. We eventually came across a solution where, basically we just make sure some of the globals that need to be defined are defined before that code is run. And all we needed to do was like basically window dot, what was it? What is the polyfill?
I love that you're like, all we needed to do was this. This was a super complicated problem, because it wasn't that Pretender doesn't work in Node. It's that Pretender is not importable in Node. Pretender imports what wig fetch, and what wig fetch has a side effect in its import. And so that blows up your whole program. So because imports get, hoisted up to the top of the application, we couldn't do something like, if Node if not Node, then import Pretender. Like that's not valid JavaScript. So we tried doing having our build tool swap in a fake Pretender if it detected Node, but we ran into all these problems. And I'm gonna make a bold statement here, but writing a web app, SPA app these days, it really does need to run in the browser and in Node. I think that server-side rendering is pretty important, and I think we're seeing that with Ember and Fastboot, with Gatsby, create React app.
It's a default
matters.
Expectation.
Yeah, I won't go as far as to say I think that Fastboot should be included in every Ember app by default, but I will say that server-side rendering is important enough that your library should support it. And we want Mirage. Mirage is that modern JavaScript feeling, and we want people to feel that when they're developing SPAs. And if it doesn't work in a server-rendered SPA, it's bad news.
For sure. No, it's so true, and it's this is why it's so good to try it out with a bunch of different people, because someone was working. I paired with someone, and they just had it, and then they it worked, and then they refreshed the page, and then it stopped working, and I was like, "What's that?" And they're like, "Oh, it's server rendering this, and." We were looking at the client-side code that was running, and then all of a sudden he refreshed the page, and he was like, "Oh yeah, the initial page is server render. I didn't even know it." And it's "Oh yeah, Mirage is not going to do what you think it is right here." And it's that sucks. So I totally agree with you. It's just becoming more of a default kind of thing. I'm looking at this polyfill that we made, and it literally just needs to define self.
Right. So I think by default in every browser-based web application there is a global called self.
Yeah, I
that
think
reflects
self
back to the window.
Yeah, self, exactly. It's like a browser API.
Okay. And because WhatWig fetch only runs in the browser, it just expects that self exists, and it's gonna look for things off of self. I think it like looks for like fetch and XML HTTP request and all that.
Right.
And so it turns out, and we notice that if you're running in a JS DOM environment, Pretender works fine. So we knew that you could run Pretender in Node. You just had to have the environment set up correctly.
Or you could import it. You could import it in Node.
Yeah, you could import it, exactly. I think that's what we discovered. You only needed self.
Right.
So we have a module that we import that has a side effect that if it's Node and self isn't defined on the global namespace, we define it. And what do we make it? We make it like an empty pojo so it can be monkey patched by WhatWig fetch and Pretender.
Yep, exactly.
Then we import Pretender, let Pretender do its thing, and then we import, what do we call it, like Mirage after.
Yeah, Pretender node polyfill is true. That's a new __ that we set, and then if that exists in the after, it unsets it.
Yep, and then we basically clean up our little mess that we made.
Right. The interesting thing, that is part of the interesting thing. The other interesting thing is that we found that out. So we discovered that was the solution and that would make it work. And so if you can think about, like, let's say Mirage is server.js module, and we're importing Pretender, and we know that before that code runs, before import Pretender runs, we want to do this thing, this piece of this 4 lines that says if self doesn't exist, self equals blah blah blah, all that stuff, and then clean up after ourselves. So then it was interesting because we basically learned a lot about ES modules in this process.
Yes.
And maybe still have some things to learn. We first basically put that polyfill code in alongside, in another module, a local module. And, polyfill before, Pretender before, and then we import before, we import Pretender, and then we import after. And we ran it, and it didn't work. And the reason is that we have roll up that is like rolling up all of our things and putting it into a final thing. Sometimes it's really nice to actually just look at that, your dist, your roll up dist, because it helps you understand what's actually going to be run. And we kept noticing that, like, the external dependencies to the project, like Pretender and all this other stuff, Lodash, were getting hoisted. And so even though you would look at a file, the server.js file, and you see import local, / before, import Pretender, import / after, when you looked at the distribution, the output, it would be switched. And we were like, how is this possible? Like, how I'm sitting here, and first of all, ES modules can have side effects.
Yes, and all 3 of these modules that you just listed all have side effects.
Yeah. So how is it the case that you're telling me what the syntax, what you're giving me a model of how to think about modules in JavaScript? They are side effectful potentially, and the order, it looks like a program. Like the order of imports looks like a program. Like, and if I write let x equals 1, let x equals 2, x equals 3, console.log x, I would expect to see 3. And I would expect those 3 statements to run in order. And it turns out with imports, it's not actually the case. So that's like a surprising thing. And when you're looking at a file in isolation, it's not clear why that is true. If you have like a main.js and you import A and then you import B and you import C, and again, modules in JavaScript can have side effects. So A could say console.log A, B could say console.log B, and C could say console.log C, and you ran main.js, you would expect console.log A, B, and C. But here's the rub. What if B imports C first? So you have main.js, right? And you have import A, import ./B, import ./C, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're just importing local files. But then the B file, b.js itself, like imports C before it runs console.log B. So
I mean, I would expect A, C, B here.
exactly, something like that. Anyways, the point is like it starts to matter when you have cycles, or the cycles are what help you understand why it's not the same as just JavaScript code that runs top to bottom. So that's the question, right? Why is it not just running? Why is it not correct to think about the imports as just you're inlining the JavaScript that they represent, and then you're just running them? Yeah, I guess maybe that's not precise.
Wait, no, keep going.
So if you have, it's the hoisting, right? So I guess if you're looking at a file that says import A, import B, import C, that is what's going to happen. I mean,
right.
For sure.
Right. Assuming B doesn't do any like trickery and import C at the top of its file.
Well, what if it did? What would it do?
You would see A, C, B. But you can't know that. You can't know that from only looking at main. You have to look at the whole import thing.
Right.
So what is the argument like now? Let's add that third party module in here.
Yeah.
And instead of import A, B, and C, we're going to import A. We're going to import Lodash, and then we're going to import C.
And it turns out that Lodash is actually imported first.
Right. So what is the logic behind this? Like, why does that import when we compile our application? We run it through rollup. Why does that Lodash get hoisted to the top?
Why does it take preference over local modules?
Yes, and especially given that
you're writing a local module to polyfill behavior.
Yeah, the A that you imported first has a side effect.
A side effect. Man, I obviously, if I can't explain this, I don't understand it well enough, but it's really confusing. So,
I mean, I guess an argument here could be, well, if Lodash actually depends on A, then Lodash should be importing A. It's weird. Like, couldn't you say like it's weird? It's weird that we're importing A to run some global side effect that then Lodash is going to depend on. Right? Isn't that just like a weird thing? Isn't that like a weird approach to writing JavaScript? If Lodash really needs A, shouldn't Lodash be importing A?
But we're just doing that for ourselves. Like, we have our own use case. It's not about Lodash needing A. It's just about us wanting to run some code that runs before Lodash is imported, or just a module is run. So let's keep talking out loud, and maybe we'll get there. But I still think there's some things I'm not understanding. So basically, we tried to do that. It didn't work because when you look at the dist, it turns out that the middle import there was hoisted because it was import pretender. And so what we did was we moved the before and after polyfill code to like literally another node module. And so when we imported it, the order was preserved. And so this led us to like just question, like, why is this not running the way it would? Like, why are these imports not running the way lines of JavaScript would? Like, if I just have 3 lines of JavaScript code and then I move them into modules and replace the lines of code with import statements, why is there a chance that it's going to change? Because it does, it can. And kind of what we discovered through some conversations and stuff, I was talking with Ed about it, who obviously knows a lot about this because he's working on Embroider, which has to do with all this stuff, and auto import, which has to do with modules. I was talking about it with Rich Harris on Twitter, who wrote Rollup and obviously understands all this stuff. Basically, where I'm at right now in my understanding is that imports, you don't want to think about them as just JavaScript code. They're declarations. And they're almost like keywords. So if you have like console.log, if you have like a file, it's like console.log A, console.log B, console.log C, and then you just move those into A.js, B.js, and C.js, and you make that main file import A, import B, import C, like you've done something different. You've changed the nature of this thing. It's not the same as it was before. In the simplest case, it might have the same, it might be the same program. It might have the same effect. Like it might have all the same outputs for every given input in a sense. But there's a chance that you will eventually not do that. Like it will be different than if you just ran the code like that. Mm-hmm. And it's because imports are like deliberately constrained. Like the whole spec for ES imports is deliberately constrained to be something that is more statically analyzable than arbitrary JavaScript expressions in code. So if you have just line of code, line of code, line of code, as we've talked about, you know, the Turing problem, the halting problem, it says you can't know statically about that program, about how it runs and what it depends on and what it uses. It's too complicated when it's arbitrary runtime code. And so the whole part of the whole point of imports is that, again, you don't want to think about them as like inlining the code that they point to. You want to think about them as a declaration. And so you can look at a program, you can look at a directory of files and see A.js, B.js, C.js, and D.js. You can look at main.js and it imports A, B, and C, and it never imports D. And you can just know D is not needed at all. Whereas you wouldn't be able to tell that if it was just code. So the imports are a way to say the code in this file is not going to be run because there's nothing dynamic that could possibly make that happen. The imports are deliberately constrained.
Right, and this is a whole design behind imports, right? Something that you can statically analyze so you can tree shake or you can know what to load before the program even runs. I think, I mean, my hunch is like some of this must come from like the browser and just loading stuff being generally slow, where with like other languages I'm familiar with, like Node and Ruby, imports are fast.
Yeah, and you can require dynamically, and
yeah, exactly.
You know, it basically like common JS require kind of works as you would expect, right? There's none of this that happens. This kind of surprising behavior. Well, maybe it's not. I don't really know. I haven't done a lot of Node like in that regard.
This is super surprising.
Yeah,
we're writing JavaScript, but it's not actually JavaScript. It's more of a declaration about it's more we're hinting to the build tool, the bundler, what our program needs. Right.
So, yeah. So I asked. So kind of Ed was talking about the motivation there. It's kind of what you said, which is like because it matters. You know, we're not running in a constrained server environment. Like it matters how the files get there. It matters if we ship files that aren't used, whereas on a server it doesn't matter. Like node modules can be a black hole. It doesn't matter. So the idea was let's have a spec that is deliberately constrained and deliberately static so that we can analyze it ahead of time and know, oh, we don't need d.js. The other point he made that was interesting was, let's say you have a future world where the modules, you know, the browser, the index.html file has like a bunch of modules and it has the imports and it understands imports and modules. The browser can now load. If you can look and say, I need A, B, and C and not D, then we can go ahead and fetch those things. And we can fetch all the JavaScript that we need, that we're going to need to run at some point in the course of this program before running it. So we don't have to run the code in order to know what code we need to download. We can resolve the imports and get the graph of dependencies ahead of time. And that's nice because JavaScript is single threaded and it only runs, there's only one thread of JavaScript in the browser. If you had to actually execute the code to find out what you needed to load, you would block execution. But if you can look at the graph of dependencies and say, all right, we need A, B, C, D, and E, then we can use multiple threads to load those resources in without having to take up the main execution thread and run the program. So the browser is able to load in the modules in parallel, and and not have to take up basically the main execution thread.
So as you're running a JavaScript program, if in a world of dynamic imports, if you're running a JavaScript program and you come across an import, you now have to stop the world, go fetch that thing, parse it, and then continue.
Exactly.
Where with statically analyzable imports, we can know everything ahead of time, fetch it before running the program. Okay.
Fetch it using another thread or a worker or something like that.
Right. We don't have to stop at execution.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's interesting because these themes have been coming up, right? And like,
I guess I have a question here. Where it's like, was this the original design behind imports? Like, why make imports follow these rules, and why not just say we're going to support dynamic import, and when you come across code, we'll just go off and fetch it?
Yeah, like what this seems like an optimization as opposed to like the first pass of a design of a module system.
Yeah, sure. Is there something about like the way we build SPAs where it's like we actually like tree shaking is so important that that we're going to need this, and this needs to be baked in from the beginning?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I'd have to know more about the history of it.
Yeah, it would be great to know like why like what was the problem the imports were trying to solve. And I guess we already have like we could always from the beginning fake a module system with something like require JS. The problem is we don't know what's needed and what's not needed, so we end up shipping 6.3 megabytes of JavaScript, oddly specific, but where with these statically analyzable imports, you can now just get rid of everything you don't need. So I'm wondering if that is like that.
Maybe
was
that's
like
where it came
core,
from. Like look at the landscape. We have require JS. We have Browserify. What would be a way to get this into the language to solve these problems? I know Yehuda worked on this stuff, so we could probably just ask him.
Yeah. By the way, statically analyzable imports is a pretty nice solution to such a problem.
Yeah, it really is. It's super interesting. And it's just interesting how much this idea keeps coming back in a lot of the work we're doing, even in like the way Octane does tracking and Vue and React do tracking. Like, how do you know what parts of a program need to change? And it comes back to a similar question, which is knowing like a dependency graph. So like Ed was talking about how tracked properties work, and you can't know ahead of time without running code kind of what the dependencies are, because a tracked property in Octane only becomes such once it's accessed the first time. It's like only when code runs and accesses it does it start tracking it, at which point you know that there's a dependency there, and if it changes, you need to re-render the template, right? And then more static like templating languages where you can like look at a template and say, oh, I know I can resolve everything there. Or we were talking about like how there's some ambiguity in like Ember templates today, but they're moving to a world where you can just look at a template and know exactly, right? There's also the difference between implicit and explicit versus dynamic and static. You can look at a template and know exactly, without running code, without having to run the program, oh, this invocation refers to this file, this invocation refers to this helper, and therefore all the other helpers in this directory are not used in this program ever. And I don't have to run the code to know that. So if you can design your APIs in such a way that that's true, it's pretty cool, right? Because it lets you basically effectively tree shake. I mean, it's the same purge to CSS and Tailwind, right? It's all the same idea there. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. One thought as you're explaining that, one thought that went through my head is like, there's definitely a trade-off here, because there are some things that are nice about dynamic programming, like the component helper. You have like some model that's like polymorphic, and you want to render a different template based off what the actual model is, and so you do like component, class name renderer or whatever you call it. And so you kind of, those things, the system, that sort of system isn't statically analyzable.
Right.
But I wonder if there's just a way you can just say like, listen, you'll never be able to figure out if these 4 components are included or not. But I'm telling you, like me, programmer, I'm telling you that they are. So just go ahead and include everything under this directory.
Yeah, exactly. Or whitelisting, or some way to mark the extra information that you need. Sometimes it can find it out. Sometimes it needs extra help.
Right. And then like the amount of times where I actually run into this problem, it's not going to bring my JavaScript from like 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes. It's just going to be a small handful of components.
Exactly. No, but it really does come up a lot because we've talked about the halting problem before, even with things like useEffect in React, where how can you write it in such a way that you know ahead of time what you need to query? In React component rendering, there's only rendering, and so you have to render to figure out what the query is, unless you do something separately yourself. And because the render function is a generic JavaScript expression, it can be anything. Mm-hmm. You run into the halting problem and you have to execute it. You can't know ahead of time. Whereas you can look at a model hook of an Ember route and see the query you need and maybe run it ahead of time.
I know, but in that
before you render the component.
But that's more the design of Ember's router. Like for us to be able to just look at a model hook without executing the program, we would have to have like a super constrained model hook, similar to imports. That's true,
but it still stands that because of the design of the router, you can do part of the program without the other part.
Yes.
Yes. Even though, the model hook is arbitrary code, so you can't know it in the same way you can know with the imports what's happening. But you can do it in 2 phases, whereas
that is a beauty of Ember's router, is that it gives you 2 phases. Also, like that's how I think of when I'm executing code on the server, and when I come to an SPA, I want to have the same mental model. Not because the server's better, it's just that's the way I think of, run a bunch of code, generate the template, send it to the client. Right. I want to have the same mental model in an SPA. Run a bunch of code, generate the template, render it.
Right. Yeah, interesting.
With React's router, I think you can recreate Embers, right? I think you can create a system where you basically render a bunch of components, and on the first render, they're always blank. They always return nothing. Mm-hmm. And then they have an effect that fetches data or whatever it's supposed to do, but they have an effect that
it only renders children once
you've satisfied some requirement. So similar to like once you're promised that the router hook fulfills. The problem is like that's like
it's hard, but it's also we've tried to do that, and it's like you still have like the flashes or whatever because you don't actually want to flush those rendering to the screen at all, but you have to at some layer. Yeah, maybe if you like pause at the top or something like that, but it's hard.
You would have to control every single thing. So like one of our things we ran into with our Gatsby app is like, well, we don't really control the top level rendering.
Right.
There's things with like React router where it hits redirect, like you have to render a redirect to redirect, and then so you're actually rendering.
Right.
So I can't like think about that. Like if I'm not gonna render anything, until I'm ready to render, then like how do I redirect? Because redirect requires a render.
Exactly.
So I believe that you can build the system, but I also just from months of experience.
You're not going to.
Yeah, and I think that like theoretically you can do this, and I have an idea of like how it would work where like your components always render nothing. I would basically copy Ember's router, right? Your components always render nothing. And yeah, every time we've tried to do this, it just gets really messy, and we try to render as much of the screen in first render, with our React components, and it's not as nice as having a model hook for sure. I guess the only thing that would change this is we'll see what suspense looks like, and if it's easier for a component to say, I'm not ready, and then one of its parents, unknown to the component, but one of its parents can decide what to do in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of as you go down this path, it's kind of fun actually coming from Ember too, because like you desire this and then you start to see like, oh, what I really want is a way, to suspend rendering. So it's like a pretty good name for it, right?
I think when suspense is, mainstream and in the guides and popular, I will fall in love with it. And then after 6 months, I'll start to see the cracks.
Yeah. I really don't. I mean, I have to rewatch. It's been a long time. I know it's been over a year since they've talked about it originally, but I know it's still a crucial part. And as we've been dipping our toes into React apps and working on side projects and learning how to integrate it with Mirage and all that stuff, we see people in the community, Ryan Florence and others, who will just make little comments, you'll hear Dan Abramov talk about how useEffect is good for data fetching, but not for persistence. And Ryan will say, you're living in a suspense world. We're not, like they're using different APIs. And so we still have to do, this is something else. There's another topic I have kind of on the list that maybe we can talk about next time, which is like, the guides and Dan and other core team members will say, effect is for something that depends on rendering. And so it's about pixels on the screen, and fundamentally it should be like cancelable. Like if you were to navigate away from a component, the effect is canceled. That's how useEffect is designed. So if there's a network request that you need to fetch the movies, not you, Siri. No, not you at all.
What did you even say to trigger that?
I don't know. If you render the homepage and you need the 10 movies to render, then it's an effect, because it's the act of rendering the /movies URL. That means you're supposed to fetch the 10 movies and then render them. And if you navigate to the about page, it doesn't matter anymore, because you're not going to need to render those movies. So there's a very close connection there. Mm-hmm. That's what useEffect was designed for. But what if you need to track that someone visited the homepage? So you actually want to send a network request that's a mutation. It's a persistence operation. It's a write operation that says that. Now, or you click save in a form and then you navigate away. You don't want to lose that. But I don't think that that's a good fit for useEffect, because fundamentally it's not a cancelable thing, and it's not, even though it is an effect of rendering, because you want an effect that's synchronized with state, all that. Anyways, you kind of get down. I want to go back and revisit some of my notes, because I wrote a bunch of stuff down because I saw some confusion there, and then I was getting confused, but I saw disagreements. I saw the core team and the guide saying one thing, and then I watched like a Michael Jackson talk where he like used effect to like track something, and it was like literally the opposite of what I was just told. So that was interesting. Like I normally don't think of differences reading and writing as like fundamentally different, but Dan seemed to suggest that it was.
I think they are. I think the example you gave is an excellent one. The fetching movies, you can think of that as a read. You don't really care if you fetch those movies and then you navigate away from the page. You don't really care about that AJAX request or that fetch request, whether it came back, whether it was just canceled or abandoned. You've moved on. But with saving, you do care. When you save something and then you navigate away, you actually do care that save completed.
For sure, but in an Ember app, if you were to read or write based on rendering or based on a user action, it wouldn't matter. If you needed to read something, you would do it in did insert element, let's say. Mm-hmm. If you needed to write something, you would do it in did insert element. You would just change it from like $.post to $.get.post, right? And then if you needed an event handler that read, you click a button and it shows something, or you click a button and it saves something. So there's a 2x2 matrix, reads, writes, and then as a result of rendering, and as a result of his user action. Because again, one of the things that Dan said to me on Twitter was like, this was like the disagreement where like, if you save a button, you could toggle some state and have an effect that watches that state and then triggers it. And that's how Michael Jackson did it in this video with hooks, but it's not how Dan would do it. He would have a function event handler where you run that code.
Well, I have a question. In Ember, is there a way in Ember to trigger an effect where you then lose like the network request? Like, okay, off the top of my head, like did insert element is always going to run. So whether you save data or write data, like you don't ever lose that network request. Like there's nothing that's, I mean, I guess you could like, I'm thinking out loud here, but I guess you could like cancel it and will destroy element. But you would be writing that code. Like you would know that you're writing code that's cancelable.
Yeah.
I was thinking of like, okay, in an Ember app, if you had an observer and then you like change some state that fires the observer and that triggers a save, but we don't write Ember apps like that.
Exactly.
Like we don't like, if we saw that in an Ember app, like we would like immediately try to explain to the person like why this is an anti-pattern, what sort of trouble that gets you into. Where I know,
but in Michael's talk, it was literally like, it was a side effect that was a use effect when you clicked undo that like saved the data to local storage, and it was as an effect. But like saving it to local storage or like even persisting it to the back end is not something that only that can be like, it doesn't matter if it happens or not, the way like a fetch to 10 movies does based on rendering. You actually need that to happen. And so I think
it shouldn't be
that's not the model for it. Should not be an effect. It should not be an effect that would be like using an effect for tracking analytics, but you don't want to use an effect for that because it can be canceled.
Well, okay. So how do you track analytics?
Well, that's a good question. I never got an answer to it. I think you hack useEffect with isMounted or something like that today, but I think it's not a good. I think they just would say useEffect is not good for mutations, but that's the only option you have today. But it's not actually the right design. It's not actually conceptually correct. It's not aligned with it.
Well, could you have like
for the same reason you wouldn't use effect to save a to-do when you click save button or submit a form. You don't use effect there.
Yes, that.
But if you don't use effect there, then why do you use effect for tracking?
Well, could you do it without using effect? Could you do something where it's like, do HTML elements have like a did insert element callback?
No, but that's the thing. You could always come back to hacking useEffect with the isMounted and a zero dependencies to hack did insert element, because there's nothing. It's something about.
So the browser itself doesn't have. Like an HTML element doesn't have an event like this thing.
Oh.
So like
it might, but that's not going to be like idiomatic React code.
No. Okay. I guess you can just win with that. I guess you can just win with that argument right there.
You're not going to see it anywhere in the guides is what I'm saying, but I'm also saying like if Michael Jackson is saying use effect, look how elegant it composes to have us persist a write operation.
But I mean, I don't buy. I know he is a React thought leader, but I do not buy that one bit because it's weird. It's super weird reading code that does a mutation. It's literally like
an Ember observer.
Yeah. Yes. And
it would be like adding observer. It would be like an add-on that like mixes in an observer that watches changes to Ember data models and saves them to local storage so you can undo them. It would be like we'd all understand as Ember developers why that would lead you to a bad spot.
Yeah.
You want a one-way data flow.
This isn't a pattern I see a lot of React people talking about, so that's another reason I discount it. I think it's like elegant and it looks cool, and there's like the benefit where you don't have to think about how the state changes. You just know that when the state changes, you fire this effect and write data, and I think there is something nice about that. But just because of everything you've just said about effect and how you can lose them.
Violates the one-way data flow.
Yeah, it's not.
But I think it's how the libraries work too, like the GraphQL libraries where you use mutation. I think under the hood they might all do basically the same thing.
They use an effect to persist data
to like trigger a network request. Also, like the React guides. Sorry, go ahead.
I just got really excited there and peaked. I think this is where your matrix comes in, though, because there's a difference between a library using an effect to fetch data and using it to write data. Because, again, with the fetching, we don't care if it gets canceled, but with the writing, we do. Yeah. And that makes the effect scary because we could lose it.
Yeah.
Why do our podcasts always end up in useEffect land?
It's really confusing. Well, it actually is related to stuff we were talking about earlier, which is like, it all kind of is related to data flow and dependencies and what do you need to know to run this code and that code. I don't know, but it's pretty confusing to me. I still don't see a consensus on a lot of this stuff, so it's confusing.
I completely agree.
I do think our experience in the Ember community, going through observers and coming out the other side, is relevant here. So us, meaning the larger Ember community, having gone through that and seeing observers is not a good way to write predictable applications.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Also, like, yeah, I guess I'm not really sure what the answer is to, because you see some of the core team on React talking about, useEffect is good for data fetching. We don't have a good story. Writes, mutations are crappy right now, but something better is coming. I don't know if that's related to suspense, if it's something else. I'm not really sure what the primitive there is.
Yeah, there's nothing. I have no idea.
Yeah. Cool.
Can we talk about one more thing before we sign off?
Yeah.
Do we have time?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to rant about JavaScript classes.
Oh, okay.
No,
I saw some conversation about it on the Twitter.
I want to do the opposite. Yeah, there was a big thread on Twitter. It was today or yesterday, complaining about JavaScript classes and saying that I think it was like Sean Larkin saying that none of the major frameworks are using JavaScript classes, and this is kind of a hint that they're a mistake. And I forget what else he said. I'm not sure if he was being like more or less charitable there, but that was the gist of the tweet. And then a whole bunch of pile on from everyone saying classes suck, don't use classes, blah, blah, blah. Really, I had like a really bad reaction to this, where I was like, classes are great. Like, classes are really great. And classes, like, if you're going to look at like modern JavaScript frameworks that, by the way, change every 3 years, like completely change every 3 years. And then you can look at classes. I actually Googled this. Do you know that like classes became a thing in the 60s? Like the term like OOP is like dates back to like the early 60s and like 1965.
I was just watching an old Uncle Bob talk about the future of programming, and he was talking about that.
Yeah, so they're like 50 years old. Yeah. So like this is like, if you think about like 50 years in programming, like they have survived a lot. And I don't want to turn this into like a like OOP versus functional programming debate. That's not what this is about. It's just, I think that classes are valuable. Classes have stood the test of time, and we shouldn't write them off because, a bunch of modern frameworks aren't using them or aren't recommending them to their users.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just like, I just wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, to me, it's just so obvious that it's not the way you write JavaScript with classes versus the way you write it with just functions versus a combination of both. That one of those three alternatives is clearly superior. It's so obviously superior that it's an obvious thing to completely exclude the other way to do it.
Yes.
There's times where I want classes to organize my code because I'm coming from a Rails background and I'm used to thinking about it that way when I'm talking about models and schemas and relationships, and it's just a natural fit. And you can tell me that there's a way to do it with just functions, but until you show me the code and I see that it's way better, I'm not going to just take your word for it. And I have a lot of evidence to the contrary that classes are a great way to organize this section of this application. And then I also have lots of places where I would want to use functions for things. And an event handler that validates and then saves and does some stuff. And if you were to turn all that into validator, object, noun, verb, or classes and create factories and do all that, I'm going to say, no, all you need is a function right here. And JavaScript has great ways to do that. Some imperative code with a sequence of functions or, basically like components that are basically calling functions and composing very nicely. That's going to work very well there. And turning all that into just object-oriented things is not going to be good. So I just don't, seems immature to me. I don't know. it's, yeah, I think, I guess we'll see too, like I guess first of all, like, yeah, React is kind of moving away from classes. If you were to say, what does a idiomatic React app look like right now? Does it have any classes at all? I don't know. Maybe that's an interesting question. Another interesting question is, are there actually any React apps that have no classes at all? Or do people end up reaching for them to organize domain-specific parts of their program?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is like I can see us writing React apps with no classes in React land. So all the components are functional or single function components, but yeah, we would still use classes. And in fact, in the apps that we have, we still use
router.
Yeah, we still use classes to organize data,
right?
You know, to control
methods and data together. Yeah, exactly.
State behavior and identity.
It's useful. Yeah. Vue has a new API for their components that is feels less like classes. So, you know, we'll see how that goes. Mm-hmm. But again, it's back to, you know, the kind of stuff we ran into with our simple apps, and do we want a class for this and stuff like that. So, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't really occupy a ton of my brain space. I feel like this is the kind of stuff, maybe it should more. Maybe the marketing and the messaging and the kind of grandstanding has more of an impact on the minds of developers. But my inclination typically here is like, no, these are just people saying this kind of thing, and we're going to see what's going to pan out. And you know, TypeScript adoption is huge, and TypeScript like heavily embraces OOP patterns as well as functional patterns. So
yeah,
it's like the silent majority, I guess. So we just lost Ryan because of technical difficulties, but we were about to wrap up there. So yeah, we'll have to see, you know, who wins, the functions or the objects or both. I'm thinking it's going to be both for a while, so we'll just have to see how that plays out. Thanks for listening this week, and goodbye from sunny California.